The rise and fall of Rover. Rover shaped British motoring for a century, then collapsed almost overnight. Here's how a legendary carmaker rose, fractured, and disappeared. Origins and early development. In the late 1800s, Coventry had turned into a kind of workshop capital for Britain. Metalwork, textiles, and, increasingly, cycles were coming out of its factories. Into that mix stepped John Kemp Starley and William Sutton, who set up Starley and Sutton Comers in 1878 with a straightforward goal: make cycles that were easier and safer to ride than the tall, twitchy machines people were used to. The company started with tricycles. That sounds modest, but it was an important stepping stone. They were easier to balance than a penny farthing and gave the firm a way to experiment with frames, hubs, and drive systems without scaring customers off. By 1883, those tricycles were being sold under a new name, Rover. The word suggested movement and exploration, and it stuck. In 1885, Starley launched the Rover safety bicycle, two similarly sized wheels, a chain driving the rear one, and a frame layout that looks instantly familiar to modern eyes. It was more stable than the towering high wheelers, less intimidating to mount, and practical enough to become a mass-market product rather than a daredevil's toy. Cycling writers at the time said this design set the pattern to the world, and that wasn't exaggeration. Most modern bicycles still follow the same basic template. As sales grew, the business identity shifted along with the technology. The firm's name evolved into J.K. Starley & Companies and then Rover Cycle Company in the 1890s, reflecting how strongly the Rover brand had taken hold. The company had gone from being just another Coventry maker to becoming one of the reference points for what a modern bicycle looked like. Starley died suddenly in 1901, but the groundwork he'd laid didn't disappear with him. Management passed on, and the people running Rover faced a new question. If they could build dependable cycles, what else could run on their engineering know-how? Within a few years, they had their answer. Rover moved into powered transport, starting with motorcycles, and by 1904, its first motor car. That shift from treadles and chains to engines and chassis is where the Rover story as an automotive manufacturer really begins. Growth, expansion, and brand identity. Once Rover had established itself in car manufacturing, the question shifted from "can we build a car?" to "what kind of car maker do we want to be?" The answer took shape through the 1930s as the firm leaned toward well-finished saloons aimed slightly above the mass market. The early P-Series models helped set that tone: restrained styling, careful build quality, and an appeal to buyers who wanted something dependable without paying prestige brand prices. After the war, Rover's work on aero engines and the move towards solihull production gave it stronger manufacturing capability. The company used that momentum to introduce saloons like the P4 and later the P5, each pushing the brand a little further up market. These cars didn't chase speed or fashion, they sold a sense of sturdiness that made ownership feel stable and long-term. Running alongside the saloon program was a very different idea. Maurice Wilks was sketching a simple four-wheel drive utility vehicle that could work on farms and handle rough terrain. That concept turned into the Land Rover, launched in 1948, built with aluminium panels and a no-nonsense layout. It found customers almost immediately and became one of Rover's most reliable export products. By the time the Range Rover arrived in 1970, the off-road side of the business had developed its own gravity. The rugged models were gaining worldwide recognition, sometimes more than Rover's saloons, and that shift in balance would matter a great deal in the decades ahead. Industry turbulence and mergers. That dual identity made Rover a tempting piece of a bigger puzzle, and in the late 1960s that puzzle took shape. In 1967, the independent The Rover Company was sold to Leyland Motor Corporation, a firm already building vehicles for buses, trucks and lighter-duty cars. Barely a year later, in 1968, Leyland merged with British Motor Holdings, itself a union of several auto marques, to form the conglomerate BLMC, the British Leyland. What promised scale and market strength quickly revealed deep structural problems underneath. Under BLMC's umbrella sat dozens of previously independent marques: economy car producers, luxury brands, sports divisions, commercial vehicle operations. That diversity meant overlapping models, competing internal priorities, and duplicated dealer networks. Rover, once a distinct mid to upper market name, now competed internally, with brands that had different identities and customer bases. Manufacturing rationalization stalled, investment got spread thin, labor troubles and industrial relations tensions compounded the problems. Frequent strikes and worker disputes cut into production consistency and quality, both key strengths Rover once had. Attempts to unify governance and production standards across the conglomerate often failed, partly because old loyalties and brand identities resisted one-size-fits-all rules. The variety that made the group broad also made it brittle. By the mid-1970s, the financial strain had become acute. The government stepped in. BLMC was partly nationalized, and the state took control of many of the formerly private marques within the group. Under this pressure, divisions were reorganized. Commercial vehicles, trucks and vans were separated from passenger cars. Heritage brands like Rover found themselves shuffled into new structures. Within that reshuffle, the original Rover saloons lost much of their autonomy. Resources flowed unevenly, some factories closed or retooled. Rover's focus as a premium carmaker got diluted by the realities of a massive conglomerate trying to hold together many moving parts. The company identity that once felt coherent now had to share spotlight. By the end of this period, Rover existed as part of the bigger corporate entity that was supposed to save British car making, not as its own independent brand. That shift from independence to being a line in a vast portfolio marked a turning point, where Rover's trajectory would increasingly depend on factors outside its original values: partnerships, modernization, and challenges. Out of that troubled British Leyland era came a simple conclusion. If the company was going to survive, it needed help from someone who knew how to build reliable modern cars at scale. That partner turned out to be Honda. A formal collaboration deal was signed around 1979, and the first visible result was the Triumph Acclaim, launched in 1981. Essentially a Honda Ballard built in the UK with light cosmetic changes. It was no halo car, but its solid reliability and tidy build quality were a shock compared with some of BL's recent efforts. Once that car proved the concept, the relationship broadened. The Rover 200 SD3 followed in 1984 as another Ballard-based saloon, this time wearing a Rover badge and sitting above the Austin Maestro and Montego in the range. Under the skin, much of the engineering came from Honda, and that showed in day-to-day dependability. For buyers who had written off British cars as flaky, these models quietly rebuilt trust in the Rover name. At the top end, the two companies co-developed a new executive car on a shared platform: Rover 800 for Europe and Honda Legend for Japan and North America. Development started in the early 1980s. The Rover version launched in 1986 as a successor to the SD1. The mechanical package owed a lot to Honda experience, while Rover concentrated on styling and interior character. On paper, it was a neat trade, Japanese robustness mixed with British cabin feel. The real sweet spot of the partnership came with the Rover 200-400 R8 line around the turn of the 1990s. These cars impressed journalists and buyers with good ride and handling, strong equipment levels, and noticeably better build than many rivals. For a few years, Rover's image in the UK climbed sharply. The cars looked smart on company car parks and didn't fall to pieces like the old joke suggested. But there were trade-offs. The more Rover leaned on Honda platforms and drivetrains, the less freedom it had to set its own engineering direction. Model cycles depended on Honda's schedule. Margins were squeezed by licensing and by the fact that Honda also wanted to sell its own closely related cars into the same markets. When later, joint models like the Rover 200, R3 and 400 HHR arrived, they sat awkwardly on price and size, and too small or too cramped for the segments they were priced in, and up against very strong competitors such as the Ford Escort and Mondeo. In the background, ownership kept shifting. The British government sold Rover Group to British Aerospace, BAE, in 1988, and then in 1994, BAE sold an 80% stake to BMW, with Honda holding a minority share for a short time before stepping away. The formal collaboration, which had effectively run from around 1980 to 1994, came to an end just as Rover was becoming more dependent on the know-how it provided. From the outside, the Honda years looked like a comeback. Inside, they also underlined how hard it had become for Rover to stand on its own. BMW era and rapid decline. The company that finally stepped in to replace Honda wasn't another quiet partner. It was BMW, and that changed the stakes completely. In January 1994, BMW agreed to buy an 80% stake in Rover Group from British Aerospace, with the remaining 20% acquired soon after. Overnight, Rover went from juggling joint ventures and state legacies to being part of a wealthy German premium manufacturer with global ambitions. From BMW's point of view, this was a way to broaden its reach. Rover gave access to smaller front-wheel drive platforms, the Mini brand, and the Land Rover and Range Rover names, plus established UK plants and a footprint in markets where BMW wanted more volume. On paper, it looked like a clever way to cover more segments without diluting the BMW badge. Inside the group, though, tensions appeared early. BMW executives and Rover management didn't always agree on positioning, product planning, or spending priorities. The UK side needed heavy investment to modernize factories and develop replacements for aging models. The German side had to justify pouring money into a business that was losing hundreds of millions of pounds a year. Public numbers later suggested that Rover cost BMW billions over the life of the deal. Some of that money did produce new metal. The Rover 600 and revised Rover 400 helped keep the range current in the mid-1990s. The heavily re-engineered Rover 200 R3 aimed at the compact class, and BMW funded development of an all-new Rover 75 class car to sit just below BMW's own 3s and 5 series. At the same time, the Germans pushed work on the next-generation Mini, which would later become a major success under their sole control. The trouble was that these products sat in awkward territory. To protect BMW's premium pricing, Rover couldn't overlap too closely on performance or image. In practice, that meant the British cars often ended up priced near stronger rivals without being allowed to match them fully in dynamics or specification. Dealers found it hard to explain exactly who the cars were for. All of this came to a head around the Rover 75. Unveiled at the 1998 Birmingham Motor Show and launched in 1999, the 75 was a mid-size saloon with retro-influenced styling, a carefully trimmed interior, and a comfort-first driving feel. Many journalists praised its ride and cabin, but the timing and messaging around it turned into a case study in how not to launch a car. Sales never reached the volumes BMW had hoped for. Combined with losses across the rest of the range, the situation became unsustainable. By March 2000, BMW announced that it would break up the group. The Munich company kept the Mini project and the Cowley, Oxford plant, sold Land Rover to Ford, and arranged a management buyout of the remaining Rover and MG car operations, which were spun off as MG Rover Group under the so-called Phoenix Consortium. The BMW era ended not with a smooth integration, but with the brand carved into separate pieces and the Rover name handed to a much smaller, far less secure company. Final years and collapse. MG Rover began life as a rescue story. When BMW handed the remains to the Phoenix Consortium in 2000, it created a much smaller company with big obligations and very little room to maneuver. With no budget for clean sheet designs, the early strategy was to squeeze more life out of what they had. The Rover 25, 45 and 75 were refreshed, and MG badged versions, ZR, ZS, ZT, added some energy to a narrow range. It kept the factories busy but couldn't hide how old the platforms were. A proper revival needed outside investment. Talks with potential partners came and went, but the most serious discussions were with SAIC. In 2004, the Chinese company bought rights to several MG Rover designs, and negotiations for deeper cooperation continued. Doubts about MG Rover's finances eventually halted progress. Once that deal faltered, the company's prospects shrank rapidly. To cover the lower end of the market, the firm launched the City Rover in 2003, a reworked Tata Indica. Its high price and modest finish drew criticism, and it failed to provide the volume boost management hoped for. By early 2005, MG Rover was relying almost entirely on the hope of a last-minute investment. When talks finally collapsed in April, the company had no financial cushion left. It entered administration on 8 April 2005, costing thousands of jobs at Longbridge and sending shockwaves through its supplier base. Most assets were later sold to Nanjing Automobile, while rights to the Rover name passed to Ford as part of Land Rover's protection. Production at Longbridge largely stopped, leaving the vast plant silent for the first time in generations. Legacy and long-term impact. Rover vanished from new car ranges, but the pieces didn't dissolve. Even after Longbridge shut down, the story didn't just stop, it scattered into other badges, factories and markets. The MG name moved to Nanjing Automobile in 2005, and then to SEC, which used Rover-era platforms to restart production. A few final assembly efforts continued in Britain before winding down, and MG became a China-built global brand. The Rover name itself passed from BMW to Ford, mainly to secure it alongside Land Rover. When Ford later sold Jaguar Land Rover to Tata, the Rover trademark went with it. It's stayed unused ever since, a name preserved rather than revived. The other survivor was Mini, which BMW rebuilt into a modern success from 2001 onward. Strong funding, clear positioning, and a simple model plan gave it the sort of stability the old group rarely managed. In China, SAIC spun Rover-based engineering into the Rowe line, starting with a model rooted in the Rover 75 structure. It meant the technical DNA outlived the brand, even if the name didn't return. Across the industry, Rover's collapse is now shorthand for what prolonged, underinvestment and unclear strategy can do to a carmaker. The success of Land Rover, Mini and MG under new owners provides the counterpoint, and that contrast is why Rover's rise and fall still appears in discussions about how companies survive or don't.